Well, we've seen how the Nine were at the beginning and how they were later on in 2005. Now we'll see them as they were in 2011, specifically for this video, how their roster looked by Infestation, Arc 11. Suffice to say, their lineup consisted of the previously talked about members of Jackslash, Siberian Mannequin Crawler, and Shadowbird, along with the comparatively newer members of Burnscar, Cherish, and Bonesaw, with the latter also bringing, along with her monstrous creations of Murder Rat, Hack Job, and Pagoda. More on them after Bonesaw's section. Speaking of, as far as newer members go, Bonesaw was the oldest in terms of years of membership. And funny enough, she became a member in 2005, specifically on January 20th, fulfilling the role of Crimson's replacement. I've previously talked about her trigger event during my first Slaughterhouse video, and like I said then, I won't be retelling it here. But if you are interested, the relevant video and part will be linked in the description and somewhere within this video. Probably. Anyway, based on what she was able to do, Bonesaw can be categorized as a Tinker, Trump, and Brute. Her main classification was Tinker, and she broadly specialized in the quote-unquote physical form, in biology, in anatomy, to the point that she can be described as the top medical Tinker. As you can infer, that mastery of the noted things not only made her very versatile, it's also where her other two classifications came from. There is a lot to cover, but first, I want to broadly talk about how she became so formidable. In my mind, it can be linked to three things. The first can be applied to all parahumans, and that is the simple fact that she's been active for a while. And because of that, she's had time to gain a deeper understanding of her abilities. And more importantly, due to her status as a tinker, that also gave her plenty of opportunities to gather materials, make an assortment of things, and conduct experiments. The second one, I'd say, can be largely attributed to her status as a member of the Nine, which is her lack of morals, which allowed her to push limits and violate taboos that most other tinkers, and more generally parahumans, wouldn't even think of doing. Finally, I'd say her deeper connection with her passenger, her shard, helped a lot in the tinker process itself. It has been shown and told time and time again that while a deeper connection with one's shard does cause issues, the more a parahuman is synced up with their shard, the more potent their power generally seemed to be. And given how and when Bonesaw triggered, the barriers that divided her as a person and her shard were thinner than usual. And, as you shall soon see, that translated to Bonesaw being one of the more, let's say, overpowered, overwhelming capes. So, to begin, the core of Bonesaw's Trump classification was her greater understanding of powers, in part developed from that deeper connection with her own power, and in part due to her less than savory research methods. Some methods being doing surgery on living parahumans and inducing trigger events, so she could monitor brain and body activity during said events. With those things in mind, there were two related things that she was capable of that did much to justify her Trump rating. One would be her ability to alter powers. However, keep in mind that it was relatively limited. Sure, it was easy enough to pull back a power, but when it related to expanding its capabilities, be it something as simple as its range, or something more integral like mental blocks, such endeavors, even for Bonesaw, were notably more difficult and or took a fair bit more time, especially if she wanted to get it right, in a manner of speaking. Plus, said improvements, at least the more on-the-spot ones, are likely to be temporary. That said, she did permanently expand Cherish's range, while also making her more biased towards sensing negative emotions. She also removed her ability to filter emotions too, all while under a time crunch. Though I don't know how cleanly it was all done, nor do I know what exactly she did. The second Trump thing would be her ability to create parahuman hybrids. I'll explain more later, but for now, all you need to know was that she could graft together two people, two capes, and combine their powers into one package. Murder Rat, Hack Job, and Pagoda were all hybrids. specifically ones done hastily and with less than ideal tools, which led to several issues, but more on that later once again. Oh, I guess I'll mention it now, but Bonesaw was responsible for the Slaughterhouse 9 clones we've been talking about. Though her ability to clone said members the way she did involved things that were not the norm for her. She probably could have done it on her own, with her own tools, but in that scenario it would have likely taken much more time, and more importantly, been much more difficult. And, while I have no real basis for this, I imagine those clones, specifically the ones of dead members she never met, would have been less quote-unquote true to the originals. Recall that even with the extremely good setup she did have in canon, she still only got them mostly right. Granted, that may have been the limit in general. To further delay, and to take another tangent of a sort, here are some miscellaneous details about Bonesaw that I want you to know, but couldn't fit in any of my planned sections, at least in a way that I would have liked. First, while she may not do this for all her technology all the time, she can put biolocks on them so that only she could use them. Second, perhaps in part due to her extensive years of tinkering, and in part due to making things like her spider boxes, she has developed a quote-unquote basic ability to hack into systems. I put that in quotes since the example in question where I derived that from involved her hacking into a PRT Endbringer shelter. And while I don't have any idea how secure such things were, I feel they would be fairly secure given what they are intended to do. Nevertheless, third, while not something she specialized in, she has been shown able to create mechanical traps, one example being hidden gas traps. Though I imagine Mannequin may have helped with said traps in some way, mostly because traps and such were more of his thing. But at the same time, we're not given that much information about the traps, so I can't really say for certain. Anyway, this last bit is more to help show how expansive her manipulation of flesh was, outside of what I'll specifically focus on later. Basically, as easy as it is to focus on the crazier things she's done, keep in mind that she can do plenty of smaller things, such as making a ghillie suit out of flesh to help blend in with corpses, or, with suboptimal resources and time, around 5 minutes, crudely modify innocent bystanders to roughly look like Slaughterhouse members, to be distractions. How classy. I will say that with more time and resources, she probably could have made them look exactly like the 9. After all, she did manage to surgically modify herself, both cosmetically and internally, to appear younger or older, respectively. Now, with that stuff out of the way, while Tinkers collaborating and or utilizing the inventions of other Tinkers was something that did happen, those that were adept at actually understanding, replicating, and iterating upon the technology of others were particular standouts. Examples being Dragon and, well, Bonesaw. In fact, Bonesaw could, through visuals alone, copy something. But as you can infer, having a physical example she could touch and take apart was preferable. That said, I don't think Bonesaw was on the same level as Dragon, mostly because she had a major restricting factor, which was the less a given creation was usable in some way for the purposes of biotechnology, the more difficult it would be to replicate or integrate with her own creations, in the sense that it would take longer to do the latter things and be more frustrating in general to do. Additionally, her ability to maintain whatever she took or copied would also be reduced, to the point that they would degrade faster than what she was capable of fixing. Interestingly enough, outside of compatibility, how confident she was in her ability to do whatever she did was another factor that more generally determined how well her tinkering went. Fortunately, she was knowledgeable and experienced enough to know how things could go wrong when it came to matters outside of her fields of expertise. So at the very least, even when she's not confident or whatever, she still had some idea on how bad things could turn out, and adjust accordingly. Okay, earlier I briefly mentioned something about spider boxes. They were headless scrap metal robots in the shape of boxes that had thin hydraulic legs, with the tips of said legs capable of being a variety of surgical tools, such as scalpels, syringes, drills, and saws. Said boxes can be controlled in several ways. Examples include what I assume to be basic verbal orders, a laser pointer to direct movement or mark a target for attack, various body gestures like finger snaps, and or a radio remote. It's difficult to tell how many Bonesaw had around her at any given time, but in one instance she was seen having at least 12 moving around her. So, the boxes came in varying sizes, from half the size of a toaster to the size of a large dog, with the dog-sized ones capable of being faster than an average person. Well, skidder. As one can imagine, what they did ranged from helping her with more mundane tasks to being assistants during surgery or combat. In the case of the latter, it could be as simple as dragging people away or using their bodies to shield her from attacks, to something a bit more involved like lashing onto people and forcing their bodies to do stuff against their will. In fact, she may even go as far as welding her spider boxes directly into a victim's skeleton. Alternatively, she could have her boxes latch onto her own back and function as a medical exoskeleton, allowing her to have a medical instrument between each of her fingers. This didn't make her physically stronger, as far as I could discern, but if it did, it was probably not by much. Granted, not being a physical powerhouse didn't mean too much anyway, since the things she did to her body still made her a pain to fight regardless. So this may be a little random, but I want to tell you that the spider boxes aren't purely machinery. As mentally stated by Bonesaw herself, their internals consisted of interconnected lumps of gray matter that handled basic impulses, motor control, and memory storage, while various computer chips handled things that were quote-unquote more trouble than they were worth to implement, presumably with just gray matter lumps. I mention that because her boxes can, if shown and through repetition, replicate complex actions perfectly. That ability came from one of her installed computer chips, specifically one that managed muscle memory, rote movement, for those that want the exact term she used. Other than that, keep in mind that there was an instance where she instructed her boxes to swarm around and gather materials from cars. More so, the person seeing it happen noted that they were quote-unquote converting the components into more spiders. You can interpret that as the components being turned into more spiders later, or as them being made on the spot. Though I doubt the latter, since I don't think she tended to keep computer chips and gray matter on her. Granted, she has been shown harvesting organic material from corpses, alongside her spiders. So I don't think it's impossible for her to make spider boxes on the field, especially if she planned to do it beforehand. Plus, there's nothing stating that all her boxes were internally the same complexity. Well, moving on. While there are many defining things someone can attribute to Bonesaw, perhaps one of the biggest ones people thought about and worried about was her ability to generate and distribute various hazards. To begin, keep in mind that Bonesaw's body was filled to the brim with diseases, and upon her death, they were activated and released onto the world. Now, what should one expect in such an event? Well, generally, it's safe to assume that she could replicate any known chemical or disease, which on its own would already be a big issue. But between her ability to modify said things to better suit her needs, and more importantly, her ability to make her own original concoctions, spreading existing plagues was only the start of how much of a menace she could be. To give some examples, first, probably one of her most chaotic and progressively destructive ones was her agnosia plague, a red miasma that would make it difficult for people to recognize and differentiate between people and objects. Worse yet, as it progressed, people would experience more severe health issues, from the comparatively lesser ones like memory loss, hallucinations, and mood swings of anger and fear, to things like seizures, significant changes in personality, and the loss of bodily control. All made worse by the fact that under most circumstances, it was incurable. Not to mention, it was designed to spread through air and to taint water sources. Additionally, if you thought you could be saved through filters, they seemed able to bypass mass filters, and it's also probably safe to assume that outside of special Cape-made ones, that heavy-duty water filters would probably be ineffective too. Another example I have is a gruesome one that caused people to bloat up and explode, with the resulting blood, guts, and bone being vectors of infection. Said plague acted quick. Within 10 seconds of initial contact with infected materials, a person would detonate. Luckily, if you want to see any sort of silver lining in this, Bonesaw designed it in a way that made it half as effective after each blood detonation, and after 4 or 5 cycles, people would be able to fight it off. Though I imagine many will still die even after those initial quote-unquote certain death cycles. Note that if this blood plague was contained within Bonesaw, it may not be the same one. The one I described was modified to be fair for one of the 9's games. Alright, I want to talk about the prepared chemicals Bonesaw seemed to carry around. They were described as quote-unquote color-coded sugar cubes, and with some water and presumably a specific combination of said cubes, she could conjure up useful substances on the run, with one example being a congealing smoke that would form into quote-unquote strands of gunk that made movement difficult. Cool. Lastly, she had power-dampening powder and darts, and how they seemed to work is that they would target the control center, the gamma, of the corona pollentia, and inflict onto someone an increasingly worsening headache, which made the use of one's power more and more clumsy until the power became altogether unusable, or at the very least diminished to the point that anything complicated or delicate would be impossible. Though, to contradict myself just a little, it was possible through mental brute force and or the right power to regain some usability. Oh, and while she probably could completely get rid of a power, the effects of the darts and powder were temporary. So, to end this section, here's a list of various other things she can make that I can't really say much about. Here's another short section for you. Bonesaw had very good observational abilities. To explain further, first, with just the experience of being familiar with the person she was planning against, she knew her deceit was known, despite giving nothing to indicate that she was going to betray. Granted, that person was a special case, so... Second, she was capable of passively noticing small changes, such as facial expressions, pupil dilation levels, and breathing rate. Third, while this can be more closely attributed to her expertise, she can give a quick and relatively accurate visual diagnosis of how a body is and how it could be, depending on the context. Finally, to say something I said earlier again, through sight alone she could quickly understand the work of another tinker. Continuing on, perhaps the most important aspect of Bonesaw to keep in mind, besides something I'll elaborate on later, was the body improvements she did to herself and her fellow Slaughterhouse members. We'll begin with the more general augmentations that they all ostensibly shared. Starting off small, we have reinforced teeth, with, as I understand, the incisors specifically also being laced with a special cutting material. Should, they need to resort to using their teeth for something. Next would be the protective mesh she wrapped around every major organ and artery. Similarly, would be the wire reinforcement around the skeleton that provided extra durability. It helped to prevent broken bones, and to mitigate damage in general. In fact, one member took a hit from what I presume to be a sniper shot, near the spine, yet only after a small period of time, they got up and running again. Sure, it wasn't a direct hit, and sure, it has been noted that the spine and organs do get an extra bit of protection, but I think you get the point. Anyway, for the reinforced skeletons, I'll also mention that whatever was wrapped around them may have been something akin to chainmail. However, that specifically was likely only applied to the spine, or was perhaps specific to Bonesaw's skeleton. It's nevertheless probably still safe to infer that the other members had more than sufficient protective meshes around their bones, even if they weren't some sort of chainmail. Right. Third, likely due to her being, Bonesaw, she's made all members fully, or at least mostly immune, to diseases, allergens, and the assorted natural toxins of plants and animals. Fourth, while I don't know their overall efficacy and capacity, she has installed auto-injection pumps within members that would dispense painkillers and antibiotics. They would start injecting in cases of serious injury, but I don't know how serious said injury needs to be for them to automatically start. Finally, fifth, she has also created artificial neural connections that functioned as a way to resist or be immune to master influences. However, keep in mind these new pathways were created to counter the power of a specific master, one that dealt with emotions. So it's unknown how effective they would be versus other masters. Though, with research, I don't see a reason why she couldn't do a similar thing versus other human-controlling masters, depending on how those master powers worked. So, despite earlier statements, there are some other bits I want you to keep in mind. Again, one, I don't truly know how uniform and standardized Bonesaw's augments were between all the members. One example being the previously noted skeleton reinforcements. Two, similar to the first point, I don't know if all members necessarily have all the same augments. Well, actually, I do know that they aren't all the same. An obvious one would be Crawler, because of the nature of his power. But another one was Damsel of Distress, who had unique augments because of her power. Oh, and while I can't confirm it, one can also safely assume that Mannequin did all or most of his own augmentations. Granted, I don't think he would be against Bonesaw, pitching in a little bit. 3, I suppose this goes without saying, but all that I've talked about is likely not a full list of what Bonesaw has given the Slaughterhouse. Finally, if you are wondering why I'm basically just listing them out, well, outside of Bonesaw's own personal augmentations, there really isn't much to go on for these more general purpose ones. Plus, because of the reputation and nature of the 9, when characters go after them, they tend to go all in, so it's difficult to establish a scale of how effective all the improvements were. It is what it is. When it came to Bonesaw, she seemed to be more heavily modified compared to her companions. Since we were already on the topics of survivability and durability, I'll begin with that line of thought. First, I'll quickly go over various things she has managed to survive. She has survived being nearly split in half. She has survived missing her lower half. She has survived pulling a spear through her chest. She has survived a knife to the throat, and she has survived being stabbed in the eye. Deeply stabbed, as in the knife scraped eye socket bone. Second, she does not bleed as much as she should. The ones doing the stabbing of the throat and eye both noted how there was little to no blood. Plus, when she was almost sliced into two, it was not a gore fest. Still had a lot of blood, but given what was done to her, much less than what one would expect. Third, while not something that necessarily helps keep her alive, she could control how much pain she felt, to the point where it was possible for her to turn it on and off, like a switch. Finally, she could replace her body parts, with some examples being her eyes, arms, hands, and even her entire lower body. Granted, how quickly and easily she could replace said parts depended not only on what needed replacing, but also on the context Bonesaw found herself in. For example, no matter the circumstances, getting a new lower body will take a notable amount of time. However, even with something smaller like a hand, with little time and or resources, even Bonesaw won't be able to immediately acquire a new flesh and blood hand. In fact, one time she was forced to temporarily use a ceramic hand. Random, again, but to mention some other details that may be of some interest. When she was stabbed in the throat, she was somehow able to keep screaming normally. And when she was stabbed in the eye, it did still hurt, but the pain seemed more along the lines of getting a bad poke to the eye. Not to mention, she seemed more concerned with having to get a new eye. The fact that she had a knife in her eye socket seemed more like a minor annoyance to her. Alright, when related to her in a more straightforward fight, while she may not be as immediate of a threat compared to her companions, as evident by what I've already stated, she was not helpless when on her own either. But to emphasize that lack of helplessness more, first, keep in mind that she could have complete control over her body. She can be acutely aware of her own brain activity and body movements. More so, she could finally control her actions to the point that she could smile, walk, and display body gestures and habits that were unlike her. Second, and related to that, while I don't believe we ever saw it in action, she also had a safeguard that would activate a berserker mode in the event of her being mentally manipulated. Third, to once again refer to her reinforced spine, besides it being extra durable, it was also prehensile. So in the event of someone, I don't know, cutting her in half, she could still be a little rascal and latch onto a person. Kind of like a jockey from Left 4 Dead, I suppose. Additionally, she could take it a step further and shove said spine down someone's throat, which allowed her to take over that someone's body. It was not a pleasant experience, to say the least, especially when you consider the fact that Bonesaw kept the person alive, to keep the body relatively fresh and usable. Fourth, she had various hidden weapons on her body, some examples being flesh-dissolving capsules of acid under her fingernails, spring-loaded needles, some sort of poison venting system, and acid spit. Though, for the spit, it would dissolve her tongue in some of her mouth. Perhaps an issue for others, but not for her, for obvious reasons. Oh, and I don't really know if this is necessary to say, but she did have a telescoping humerus, which is certainly something. Now, consider this a prelude of sorts for the next section. So, Bonesaw had something in her toolkit called control frames. They were mechanical frames integrated into a body. They were interlaced with the largest bones in said bodies and had needles stick into the brain and spine, which allowed her to control the living and the dead, albeit the recent dead, about a week or so old. But I assume any body that was sufficiently preserved too. Granted, that is an assumption. Plus, I can't even really tell you what would be considered sufficiently preserved. Anyway, as you may have pieced together, echoes of this were present in her other inventions and such. One would be her spine, which was like a crude sort of control frame that only stuck needles into the spine, that also required more of her direct control. Another would be the spider boxes, when they latched onto people. Doubly so when considering the times she welded them onto someone's bones. Right. Why did you need to know all this? Well, in short, the control frames were one of the core things for her parahuman hybrids. Speaking of, while still part of Bonesaw's section, the hybrids merit their own part. To begin, the ingredients to create a hybrid involved a control frame and at least 2 parahumans, with fairly intact chronoplentias. Though, I'm uncertain on how intact the Gemma needed to be. As far as I know, while living parahumans were preferred, mostly intact, relatively freshly dead, or preserved body worked too. For example, Hatchetface was dead for at least a month or so before his body was used for one, though the hybrid he was a part of was noted to be rotting alive, and that grafts of flesh and mechanical replacement parts were filling in the rotted gaps. Hybrids can be put into 2 categories, the ones in this video and the ones in a future video. Focusing on the former, those were more poorly made, albeit not completely on purpose. They were how they were more due to a lack of time, optimal resources, and experience. However, they did have the potential benefit of having the full powers of the parahumans they were composed of, with some minor tweaks. Though their mental and physical state did degrade rather quickly. They started more like a normal person, but rapidly became something only really useful for combat. And even then, said degraded state probably lowered the effectiveness they could have had with their full powers too. Granted, I suppose their effectiveness would also be influenced by what powers are combined, and or how much experience a hybrid got with the powers. The other category of hybrids are more stable, and do seem to generally have more unique power sets. Basically, these hybrids seemed to have a better blend of their included powers. But, from what I could tell, certain individual parameters were reduced, and as such, parts of the other power may have, at times, been altered to make up for that fact. More on that in the final video of this series. Nevertheless, the really important detail to mention for these hybrids is that they were made from some of those Slaughterhouse 9 clones, which, like I said earlier, were made when Bonesaw had significantly more time and better resources than she normally did. By contrast, if you must know, the more crude ones were made from pre-existing dead and alive parahumans they captured or collected. Marsa, Bonesaw had around 2 years to plan out and experiment making her Slaughterhouse hybrids. By contrast, Murderat was ostensibly her first hybrid, and not long after that, I'd say between a few weeks to a few months later, she made Hack Job in 4 hours, mind you. As for Pagoda, they seemed to have been made as more of a sort of demonstration piece for Panacea. Granted, there is nothing against the idea that it was at the same time also made as a form of practice for Bonesaw. She did say that she was only just starting to do parahuman mashups after all, at the time. Anyway, I should mention that Bonesaw can fuse together more than 2 powers, more than 2 parahumans. However, in exchange, the various parameters of said powers would get more and more reduced as more powers were added. I'll also mention that I don't really know how much more stable the higher quality hybrids were, specifically their long-term longevity in terms of their mental state and physical state. As far as I know, that was never stated, or shown. Now, in terms of just how they generally were, under different circumstances, they potentially could have qualified as quote-unquote real Slaughterhouse members. Maybe. So, to refer to control frames one more time, they were Bonesaw's failsafe. In the event of her hybrids being disabled or taken over, she could kill them instantly, through destroying the heart or through some other specialized means. They were also her way to control her creations if they started to become unruly or were unruly from the start. Well, nothing else to say, so on to Bonesaw's first, let's call them, generation of hybrids. First of all, the one I have the most to say for is Murderat. She can be categorized as a mover, striker, and brute. They were made from the parahumans Mouse Protector and Ravager. Mouse Protector could mark objects and people through direct touch, turning them into beacons that she could later teleport to on a quote-unquote whim. She also had more minor enhancements relating to agility, stamina, and body coordination. For Ravager, her physique and ability to fight were enhanced, and her main ability was inflicting wounds onto people that would horrifically fester, bleed, and scar. For example, if left untended, a scratch on the stomach could widen to the point that one's guts would spill out. Note that while she could inflict such wounds with her bare hands, she was able to imbue that worsening wound property onto things, be they everyday objects, actual weapons, or even ammunition. Also, keep in mind that anyone she wounded, she could track, through some sort of clairvoyant awareness. Now, how does all that translate to Murderat? Well, when they wound someone, the wound would begin to fizzle and emit smoke. It would also be infected by a sort of venom that would widen wounds and make natural healing take much longer. More importantly, the people she wounded would also become teleport beacons. And when she teleported to said beacons, there would be a boom of smoke before she materialized. As for their body, their mouth only had canines. Their fingers and toes were replaced with long machete blades. Their skin was as tough as leather, and while initially intelligent, enough to be considered an actual Slaughterhouse member, she was one of those hybrids that degenerated into nothing more than a sort of attack dog for the 9. Also, her control frame kill switch was needles around the heart. Well, that's all I have for Murderat, and to be honest, that's also all I have for Mouse Protector and Ravager. Anyway, Pagoda was purely a brute, and they were composed of Carnal and Prophet. Carnal had a healing factor that increased by bathing in blood, and all we know about Prophet is that they were some sort of regenerator too. When put together into Pagoda, they healed damage extremely quickly. So quick in fact, that even when Panacea was actively trying to kill Pagoda, the healing factor was still faster. Other than that stuff, Pagoda did not feel pain, and it looked like a monstrous centaur creature. The bottom being a large, muscled body that was built like a gorilla, and the top being a thin man with greasy hair and a beard. Hack Job was a brute, trump, and mover. They were composed of Hatchetface and Oni Lee. Hatchetface's power nullification was weaker with Hack Job. They essentially needed to be right next to someone for it to work. Additionally, I assume if not worse, Hack Job also likely had at least enhanced strength equal to what Hatchetface had. As for Oni Lee's teleportation, teleporting would gradually physically damage them. More teleports equals more wear and tear. Also, instead of just disintegrating into white ash, Hack Job's clones would explode and leave behind white dust and blood splatters. Ostensibly, Hack Job also retained the ability to have their clones act on their own for a few seconds, 5 to 10 seconds, before they exploded. Lovely. Until the video after the next one, I'm done with hybrids. So, Cherish was the newest new member, at this point, and she was a master. No one can certainly apply a Thinker classification on her too. Her power was the ability to detect and control emotions. And to get the quick stuff out of the way now, first, she can influence multiple people. Though I don't exactly know the limit to that. At the very least, she seemed fine manipulating a group of people. Imagine those scenes in movies and shows where a character is being swarmed and followed by people wanting to get said character's attention and such. Second, she does not need line of sight to exert influence. Finally, her power made learning languages easier. Apparently, knowing the feelings behind the spoken words helped a lot. I don't quite get it, but yeah. Anyway, let's elaborate on the detection part of her power. First, her range, relative to the power she had, was quite big. From what I was able to put together, it was around 900 feet to 1200 feet. Or alternatively, somewhere between 274 meters to 366 meters. Note that she may not actually be able to reach those higher range limits. I was perhaps being a bit generous in those estimations. A more conservative upper range would be around 1,000 feet or 305 meters. I only gave those higher numbers because as far as I understood it, Cherish's range was less than Skiller's at the time, 1,200 feet. Now, second, Cherish detected emotions as if they were music. Through listening to said music that came from people, she could understand and interpret the biological processes that guided emotions. To add to that, when listening to see how people felt, she generally knew which emotions were tied to which part of the brain. Third, that same music also served the purpose of allowing her a way to identify and track people. To her, every person had a quote-unquote fingerprint of emotions in deeply individual configurations. One more general example of that was how she could hear underlying notes of a certain type of pride and confidence. And paired with a degree of context, she could tell that the people she was facing weren't just armed men, but men with prior military experience. Finally, let me just talk about the various other emotions she heard, and some of the quote-unquote music she heard from said emotions. Besides being able to discern the sounds of, as just stated, pride and confidence, she could hear love towards family, the fear of death, anger towards her, and anxiety related to overreacting to a situation. In terms of music we know of, or well, I know of, alarm translates to something jangling and dissonant, and extreme anxiety, or alternatively, the feeling of being in danger, translates to throbbing percussion. To begin this section about the controlling part of her power, I don't know if it shares the range of her detection. Based on what I could tell about her fight with Hatchetface, and the bits we see from her other appearances, I don't believe so. That aside, first, how she manipulated emotions was described as her reaching out and tugging at an emotion. In cases where the latter wasn't enough, she further pulled and twisted at the emotions, while also shoving and squeezing all other things she didn't want to the far edges of someone's consciousness. With all that in mind, and to continue the music analogy, she could tune the music within people. That can mean turning camaraderie, brotherly love, and trust into feelings of suspicion and paranoia. That can also mean turning someone's love for their family into a love for her. More generally, she could significantly amplify existing emotions, such as increasing someone's depression, guilt, and self-loathing, to the point where they would either kill themselves without Cherish's input, or alternatively, be pushed to a point where Cherish would provide the second to last step and tell someone to kill themselves. While on the topic, that verbal control over someone varied depending on the circumstances. For cases where she could more or less full on tell people to do things, those seemed to require a degree of finesse. I'd say not too much, but enough. Mainly a combination of catching someone unaware and having enough time to get a read on said someone's emotions. After all that, she could quote-unquote stall a person's music. In other words, sever someone's connections to their emotions. Make people obedient by making them quote-unquote adrift in apathy. Removing their ability to feel anger and hatred, and perhaps more importantly, removing their sense of self-preservation. Now, with such a great ability to influence people, a good question to ask is how long the effects lasted. Generally, when she's not actively manipulating someone, her power was relatively short-lived. However, there was a way for her to induce longer-term effects. You see, emotions are like drugs, and like drugs, one can become dependent on them and/or form tendencies related to them. Knowing that, Cherish would microdose people with a given feeling depending on her long-term desires. For example, if she wanted someone's prolonged affection or devotion, she would give them small doses of dopamine whenever they saw her. Now to pivot, let's talk weaknesses. First, the most relevant one would be her unique interactions with her siblings, with the other children of Heartbreaker, the Heartbroken. From the limited times we've seen of the latter, the interactions to keep in mind were how the Heartbroken's powers would cancel each other out, and or how the Heartbroken could not directly use their powers on each other. However, note that the latter does not mean the powers couldn't be used altogether. As in, with the risk of leaving themselves vulnerable, a Heartbroken could, quote-unquote, force the issue, and brute force their power into working on a sibling. Alternatively, they could render the expression of one of their siblings' powers useless. For example, while Cherish couldn't really target Hijack himself, she could overload the emotions of the people he was controlling, making said minions, puppets, let's say, useless. In the same vein as the Heartbroken, Cherish was also vulnerable to other masters or parahumans with powers related to emotions, and more broadly one's mental state. For example, Gallant's power confused her emotion sensing, and perhaps more importantly, Gallant's metaphorical emotion bullets could disable people under her control, or better yet, even dispel her emotional manipulation altogether. Granted, this could likely go both ways too. As much as her power may be disrupted by another, her power could be disruptive too. Alright, outside of those more parahuman specific weaknesses, ostensibly the further away you are from her, the less effective her power was. I say ostensibly because while we know her detection range was fairly big, whenever we actually see her use her power on people, she was relatively close to them, at least in the scenes I remember. So, while perhaps much less foolproof, people with some degree of training against masters and strangers can put up some resistance against her, but said resistance being even stronger if the person in question had some prior experience being under master influence. In fact, as it pertains to Cherish, and if I read it correctly, someone can progressively build up immunity against her power, though, as I understood it, that relates to the shorter-term version of her power, and not her longer-term subtle dosing. Nevertheless, that was still good. That made the short-term effects last even shorter, and the effects themselves became less potent. To add some final musings, between her swarm range being bigger than Cherish's detection range, and her ability to shunt her emotions into her swarm, Skidder, at least in a direct confrontation, at least on paper, would likely be troublesome for Cherish to go against. Fun times. Burnscar was a shaker and mover. She was a pyrokinetic with an interesting extra twist of being able to teleport through flames. Since it'll be quick, the latter mover aspect has little concrete information about it. While I can speculate that it may have had a potentially limitless, or I guess functionally limitless range, based on the little we have to go off of, one can speculate and infer that the range was realistically much smaller. Perhaps big enough to encompass a big nightclub, but ostensibly not that much bigger. To speculate more, with something with even less evidence to back it, there was also the idea that she could only teleport through fire she herself created or started. Now, before I start listing what she could do, yes, she was fireproof. One would think that goes without saying, but powers don't always play perfectly nice with their given host. Also, while I don't think it happens all the time, it seems like when she's thinking of using her powers and or actively using her powers, or is just generally angry, her eyes faintly glowed or flashed orange. Cool. First, she could quote-unquote snake fire over water surfaces. Second, she could emit flamethrower-like twin streams of fire from her hands. Third, she could generate concussive explosions, with said quote-unquote explosions better described as intensely hot but brief eruptions of fire that could push and knock people down. Note that these eruptions did not have a shockwave, or at least one that could do serious collateral damage, and that they also generated very little noise. I suppose one can think of them more like flashbangs, except instead of a blinding flash and deafening sound, you get the noted shocking heat and hard push. Fun stuff. Fourth, with, I assume to be bare feet, she could leave burning footprints on the ground that would slowly swell and spread out, eventually joining together with the other fire prints to create a flaming path that further set other stuff on fire. Fifth, she could lob and or fling fireballs capable of punching holes through walls. Sixth, she could also generate flame images, with one example being her copying characters from a graphic novel she was reading, though it's unclear how accurate they were to said characters. Note that these figures were small, around a foot high or around 300 millimeters. Finally, she could put out flames at will. Specifically, she could rapidly shrink flames and let them fade. While not a weakness per se, the following was a major issue for her. Basically, while the ability itself was not entirely at fault, when using her ability, she experienced a specific feeling. Basically, after experiencing several psychotic breakdowns, her shard took advantage of said breaks and made a mess of the chemical balances and connections in her brain. Specifically, 1. When fire was nearby, she couldn't help but want to use her power. More so, 2. The more fire there was around her, the more psychotic she got. Her ability to empathize became more and more non-existent, and her self-control deteriorated, leading to a higher degree of impulsivity. As you can imagine, all that helped to create a quite effective feedback loop. Her power more or less forced her to start fires, and the increasing flames around her made her want to use her pyrokinesis even more. Not to mention, to add further chaos to that formula, she also had varying degrees of added recklessness, depending on her levels of depression, fear, and felt vulnerability at the time of the given situation. In fact, her recklessness can get to a point where she may potentially attack her allies. All that said, and luckily for her, she did seem to have a limit to how much she could snowball and spiral down, relative to the circumstances. From what we see of her, she never got immersed in her power to the point where she couldn't be pulled out of her psychotic pyromania. Granted, from what I remember, there never really was a situation where we saw her fully let loose. The 2 times we actually got to see her do her thing, one was more of a rescue, so she had to be somewhat mentally stable, and the other was a quote-unquote reunion that had her actions be somewhat tempered by her joy of meeting her friend again. Granted, she was still very destructive in both cases, and she probably would have gone on a rampage in the latter example had her friend not told her to leave. Though, now that I think about it, I can only imagine how much worse her attack could have been if it wasn't the botched reunion that it was. Oh boy, what a video that was. I evidently decided to put the Slaughterhouse 9 post-Prey into their own video. Truthfully, it's probably not needed, given how short that may or may not be, but I suppose this video is long enough. Right, since they'll probably come out pretty soon after this one, maybe tomorrow, maybe same time next week. See you then, probably. Should I? I guess I should. Like and subscribe. Ugh, disgusting.